Your Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy's evening lecture. My name is Danny Kwa. I'm a professor in economics here at the school, and I'm here this evening to welcome our founding dean, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, back to the Lee Kuan Yew School, the school that he built, that he might this evening launch his new book, Has the West Lost It? You will have seen that this book is subtitled, A Provocation. For those of you who have followed, as I have, Kishore's writings through the decades, you might think that subtitle superfluous and redundant. After all, what else has Kishore ever been but provocative? Thought-provoking, but at the same time, always evidence-based, empirically grounded. What Kishore writes always turns out intelligent, thoughtful, and pressing. Reading him, I hope you'll forgive the analogy, it's like taking a cold shower. It's bracing in waking those of us who have fallen asleep at the wheel, but also refreshing that it energizes all of us onwards to newer thinking. Like a cold shower, Kishore's writing is not meant to keep you over-comfortable. In this new book, Kishore returns to the question of world order. He remarks on the historical aberration that is Western centrality in the global system. He reflects on the powerhouses that are China and India today, and he asks where the world goes next. What have been the West's failures in these last 200 years? What will endure as the West's successes? Now, with the international system poised for change in global leadership, how will the West respond? Now, I'm going to begin and turn over to Kishore, but just a few words of housekeeping. Might I suggest that you either turn off your mobile phones or set them to silent. Kishore has agreed to speak for between 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will have a question and answer session. I will say this again as we approach that time, but to ask your question, you will notice that there are standing mics around the hall. To ask your question, please go up to the standing microphones, or if you have special needs, please so indicate to me, and a microphone will be brought to you. A queue will usually form to ask questions, so please get to the microphones early as we come down to the end of Kishore's presentation. I get to moderate this evening's session, and I would like to maximize conversation with the audience. So when it comes to the question and answer session, I will ask you, and I'll ask you again, that you please describe the setting very briefly for what you want to say, but then get to your question quickly. The only thing that remains for me to do now is to ask you, in joining me, welcoming to the stage our Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy founding dean, Professor Kishore Mahbubani.
When I left the school on 31st December, of course I didn't know who was going to succeed me as the dean of the school. But I did have a secret hope. And my hope and dream was that I would be succeeded by Professor Danny Kwa. So a round of applause for Danny. And it's such a pleasure to be back here with so many old friends, young friends, former bosses, Mr. Dhanabalan, who unfortunately spoiled me. He was such a good boss. He never prepared me for the other bosses that followed. And probably I had an equally good boss in Professor Wang Gangwu as chairman of the board. So I have many, many old friends here, and I'm very happy to be back here. And some of you I know are very curious what happens after you step down as a dean. I'm pleased to inform you that life gets better. I'm actually having a wonderful year this year. I have a 9-month sabbatical. I just spent 3 months at Columbia and Harvard universities, and I got a remarkably warm reception over there. And tomorrow morning I'm flying out to Fudan University to spend 2 months there, because my project this year is to write a book on US-China relations, because that's the most important geopolitical relationship of our time. Then after that I go to Paris, I go to Washington DC, and I go to everywhere. So life after deanship is actually wonderful. So I'm very happy to be back here to talk about the book which I actually launched in London a few weeks ago, Has the West Lost It? And despite its rather provocative title, my friends who read it actually said, Kishore, this is a love letter from you to the West. And one of my goals in the, I guess, 25 minutes or so I have here is to explain why this is a kind of love letter to the West. I mean, the West only provides 12% of the world's population. Why should we be concerned about it? And then the second part, I'll talk about why I think the West has lost its way. And the third question I'll try to answer is, what can we do to help the West, or what is the best course for the West to take? So let me begin with the first question, why does the West matter? The West matters for a fundamental reason for all of humanity, because if the Western civilization hadn't succeeded, hadn't modernized, hadn't achieved all these tremendous breakthroughs in science and technology, the breakthroughs in reasoning, humanity would have been in a much, much worse condition. The reason why the human condition today has never been better is because of the gifts from the West to the rest. And that's why what happens in the West matters a great deal. Now, I know many of you are drowning in pessimism and picking up bad news, and you think, gosh, where's Kishore? Obviously, this sabbatical has got into his head. He's got opium in his brains. He doesn't understand that the world is falling apart. How does he say that the world has never been better? Let me read from pages 9 and 10 of the book and describe to you how some of the challenges that humanity has been struggling with for thousands of years, we have now finally succeeded in solving many of them. Take the age-old, eternal question of war and peace. And throughout human history, thousands, millions die in wars. And we keep thinking wars will never end. Of course, they won't end completely. But any future historian from the year 2100, looking at 2018, will say this is the luckiest generation of human beings we've had, because the amount of violence has gone down dramatically in human history. Let me quote what Harvard's Steven Pinker says. And I actually spent over an hour with Steven Pinker when I was in Harvard. And he's actually come out with even a new book, Enlightenment Now, which I recommend to you because he provides you amazing data on how the human condition has improved. But this is what he said. He said, today we are probably living in the most peaceful moment of our species' time on Earth. He adds, global violence has fallen steadily since the middle of the 20th century. According to the Human Security Brief 2006, the number of battle deaths in interstate wars has declined from more than 65,000 per year in the 1950s to less than 2,000 per year in this decade. And even if there's a temporary blip because of killings in Syria or Yemen, the long-term trend is still carrying on. That's in the area of war and peace. Let me talk about another area we've been trying very hard to change the world, to get rid of absolute poverty, right? Now let me give you this incredibly stunning statistic from Oxford's Max Roser. In 1950, that's not so long ago, that's 2 years after I was born, 1950, 3/4 of the world were living in extreme poverty. In 1981, it was 44%. By 2016, the research suggests that the share in extreme poverty has fallen below 10%. In my lifetime, from 3/4 of the world's population to less than 10%. And the National Intelligence Council of the United States, a very conservative body, has predicted it might come to 0 by 2030. And I tell you, I guarantee you this, any future historian looking at the past 3 decades will say these 3 decades were the best in human history. Just one more quote, for those who some of you may still be skeptical. Johann Nobuck of the Cato Institute notes, if someone had told you in 1990 that over the next 25 years, world hunger would decline by 40%, child mortality would halve, and extreme poverty would fall by 3/4, you'd have told them they were a naive fool. But the fools were right. That's truly what has happened. And actually, I can give you even more data to show you that the human condition has improved dramatically. And I can also show you that all of this was due to the success of the West in the past few hundred years. And so that was a tremendous gift from the West to the rest. So this is the moment of great triumph for the West. The West should be celebrating and say, hooray, we did it. But if you've just come back, as I have, from 3 months in America and Europe, I can tell you the mood in both Europe and America is very depressed. There are no celebrations on the streets there. There's no sense of celebration that the West, really, this is a great moment for the West. So the second question, therefore, is, where did the West go wrong? What happened? And that's also what I try to answer in this book. And in my view, what happened is that the West made 3 critical strategic mistakes. And these critical strategic mistakes were made precisely in the 30 years when the rest of the world was changing and moving upwards in a dramatic direction. So what were the 3 strategic mistakes? The first was in 1990. And 1990 is a very critical year in human history because that was about the time, about the end of the Cold War, and the West was triumphant, saying, hey, we did it. We defeated the Soviet Union, one of the world's greatest empires without firing a shot. They were so happy. The sense of exhilaration was tremendous. And it was reinforced by a very famous essay that Francis Fukuyama wrote called The End of History. His basic message was, hey, we in the West have won. We don't have to change. We've achieved liberal democracy. The rest of the world has got to change and adjust. We can just keep going on autopilot. And as I say, in a somewhat cruel fashion in the book, Francis Fukuyama's essay did a lot of brain damage to the West because he put the West to sleep at precisely the point when the rest of the world was waking up, and especially when China and India were waking up. And why was China and India waking up so important? Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the 2 largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and North America took off. And this statistic is important to absorb because it makes it very clear that the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration. All aberrations come to a natural end. At some point in time, China and India would wake up, and precisely at the moment when China and India were waking up, after Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations, after Manmohan Singh's reforms in India, the West went to sleep and therefore was caught off guard. The second strategic mistake was in the year 2001. So what happened in 2001? In 2001, everybody remembers 9/11. And I know 9/11 is significant. I was in Manhattan when it happened. I didn't see the towers come down, but I was right there. I felt the shocks, the political shocks, and I could understand why the West decided we must focus on terrorism, invade Afghanistan, invade Iraq. And then the West didn't notice that something far more important happened in 2001, which was China's admission into WTO. And of course, when China joined WTO, and if let's say you inject 800 million new workers into the global capitalist system, you get what Joseph Schumpeter described as creative destruction. It was inevitable that jobs would be lost in America and Europe. And this has now been documented by an American economist called David Autor, A-U-T-O-R. So clearly, what the West should have paid attention to, it didn't pay attention to. And if at the end of the day, you want to know why Trump happened, why the people voted for this populist politician, is because they didn't pay attention to China's admission into WTO and how it would change the global economic system dramatically. Second strategic mistake. The third one is even more recent, 2014. What happened in 2014? Let me give you one statistic. In 1980, in purchasing power parity terms, as a share of global GNP, the United States share was 25%. China's share was 2.2%, less than 10% of the United States. And people thought, well, China will of course continue being far behind. And then, in what future historians will regard as an absolute miracle, in 34 years, by 2014, in PPP terms, United States became number 2, China became number 1. And the amazing thing is, nobody paid attention to that. So the fundamental mistake that the West made is that it didn't seem to be aware that the world had changed fundamentally. And when the world changes fundamentally, you have to adjust. And so this book is essentially a love letter to a friend saying, wake up. The world has changed. You can no longer continue on autopilot. You too have to adjust and adapt. But if I can say something even more cruel, the greatest weaknesses of Western public intellectuals is that they have become so arrogant, so confident that they know the world better than anybody else, that they've lost the art of listening and the art of paying attention to other voices. So even a letter like this, even a book like this, which is meant to be a gesture of friendship, came out a month ago, has not been reviewed once in any Western paper. Not even a British paper where London where it came out. I'm not surprised, because the West has lost the art of thinking strategically and thinking long-term and listening to the rest. And that's a huge part of the problem in the West. So again, in an effort to be helpful, I say, okay, let me give you 3 suggestions of how you can make create a better world for the West. And I describe it as the 3M strategy. 3M doesn't refer to the mining company in Minnesota. It refers to 3Ms. The first M, 3M words. The first M word is minimalist. And many in the West are actually not aware that as a result of the explosion of Western power, especially after the Industrial Revolution, the West got into the habit of intervening all over the world. I mean, you saw this, of course, most powerfully in the 19th century, when quite amazingly, a small continent like Europe could colonize the whole world. I mean, again, a future historian would be amazed. Wow, the whole world, every corner was touched. Even a small country like Portugal, population same as Singapore's, could colonize Latin America, Brazil, could colonize Africa, Angola, Mozambique, could take a bite of India in Goa and take a bite of China in Macau. How did a small country do that? That showed you how powerful the West had become. And the West thought that as it sort of decolonized and retreated back to their own countries, that they had stopped intervening. Actually, Western intervention continued in so many areas, in so many regions. And this is, again, a future historian will see this very clearly and say, why? For example, why should the West intervene so much in the affairs of the Middle East? How do incredibly bright, well-trained graduates of the leading universities in America believe that you can make Iraq into a democracy overnight by sending a few 100,000 American troops? Absurd, right? Inherently absurd. But they did it with great conviction. This desire to intervene, this habit of intervention, has led to many of the problems that you find in the world and in the West. So my advice to them is, step back. The rest of the world, and this goes back to my first point, are learning how to improve their societies themselves and becoming more peaceful places. And Exhibit A, fortunately, despite all the problems now and then, is our region, Southeast Asia. Fortunately, you notice that the less attention the West paid to Southeast Asia, the better we did. So ASEAN is already now the 7th largest economy in the world, if some of you have read my book, The ASEAN Miracle with Jeffreyson, and well on its way to becoming the 4th largest economy in the world. This was supposed to be a hopeless corner of the world. So things have changed. The West doesn't have to intervene. And you know, the West always says, if we don't do it, if you don't follow our way, things will get worse. So I say, let's take two countries. Two countries that have been run by military regimes for a very long time. One is Myanmar, the other is Syria. ASEAN took care of Myanmar, the West took care of Syria. How did the West take care of Syria? You have a problem, start bombing. Impose sanctions, isolate them. Myanmar, ASEAN said, no, we don't isolate. We admitted Myanmar into ASEAN. And the EU stopped talking to ASEAN because we admitted Myanmar into ASEAN. And still hasn't said sorry for that. And look at Myanmar today, and look at Syria today. So you can see that the West has got to change. If it wants to have less Syrias, it's got to learn from ASEAN on Myanmar. So be minimalist. The second M word is multilateral. And multilateral is a very, very important word. I know it's designed to put you to sleep. Most people, when you say, I'm going to come to listen to talk of multilateralism, nobody comes. They switch off, their brains. But you know, one of the results of the amazing transformations I spoke about in part 1 of my remarks about the world becoming a better place is that the world has also shrunk, become small, interconnected, become a real global village. We know that. That's why you have global problems like global warming, global financial crisis, global pandemics, global terrorism. It's a small, interdependent world, global village. What do you do when you have a global village? You set up a village council to run the village. So when you create a global village, you need stronger global village councils. And one of the things that is the most stupidest thing that the West has done is that it created the best multilateral institutions after World War II, and these multilateral institutions have worked because they have prevented a World War III, and they have served the world well, whether it's the United Nations, IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization. These are Western gifts to the world. We need them more and more. Therefore, the West should be strengthening multilateralism. Can you believe it? They're doing the exact opposite. Even today, Donald Trump, if he continues in his way, is going to destroy one of the most precious organizations on planet Earth, which is the World Trade Organization. Why? Why are you undermining multilateral institutions when you need to strengthen them? Right? And here, although a lot of the damage is being done by the United States, my great criticism of the European Union is that the Europeans have been cowardly and supplicant in their attitude towards multilateral institutions, and they haven't protected them and defended them enough. Although I will say, as a qualification, I was so happy when President Macron recently, as you know, went to Washington, D.C. and spoke to the US Congress. The one word he used over and over again was multilateral. And that's such an easy thing to do. And therefore, if you can make that small switch in Western policy, the world will be a much better place. So what's the last M word? Now, I better warn you. Danny said I'm always provocative, but my last M word is especially provocative. The last M word is Machiavellian. Of course, I know that Machiavelli is a controversial figure. In fact, Leo Strauss, one of America's greatest political scientists, described Machiavelli as a figure of evil. Fortunately for me, I did a course on Machiavelli when I was studying philosophy at Dalhousie University, and I read a wonderful essay on Machiavelli by a British liberal philosopher, a very famous one, called Sir Isaiah Berlin. And if you read that essay on Machiavelli, it becomes very clear that Machiavelli's goals at the end of the day was to promote what he called virtue, V-I-R-T-U, an Italian word which roughly translates into virtue. He was trying to achieve the right goals. But you're saying sometimes you have to use different means to achieve the right goals. So Machiavelli, at the end of the day, is not an evil figure. And if Machiavelli were alive today, and if he saw what Europe and America were doing, he would say, hey, please think again. Now let me end by giving you one specific example. As you know, we live in a time of tremendous geopolitical change. I mean, we live in absolutely amazing times. If somebody had written a novel that the President of America would meet the President of North Korea in Singapore hotel, they'll say, you're dreaming, right? That's not good enough for fiction. But the fiction is happening. I mean, that's an example of how the world is changing so much. Huh? This makes life incredibly interesting. But geopolitics, the reason why the word is called geopolitics is because GEO stands for geography. Now, let me say something absolutely brilliant. The geography of North America is not the same as the geography of Europe. Anybody can see that, right? North America doesn't have to worry about North Africa, doesn't have to worry about the Middle East, doesn't have to worry about the Islamic world. It only has to worry about Mexicans and Canadians. That's all, United States. Europe's geography is different. Europe's got North Africa. And behind North Africa, I wrote an essay 25 years ago, which, by the way, this is another piece of good news for you, I'll be actually launching not one book, but 2 books today. The 20th anniversary edition of my first book, Can Asians Think? And if you can find an essay which I wrote called The West and the Rest, you notice I've been talking about the West and the Rest for 25 years. In that essay, I point out that, the Mediterranean is just a small pond that's dividing Europe from Africa. If Europe doesn't export development to Africa, Africa will export Africans to Europe. You could see that so clearly 25 years ago. And in the same period, let me give you another statistic, okay? In 1950, Europe's population was twice that of Africa's. Today, Africa's population is more than twice that of Europe. And by 2100, Africa's population will be 10 times that of Europe. I'm not tall enough. I can't do that 10 times. Isn't it obvious that unless Europe exports development to Africa, it's going to have a problem? And you know what? There's one country trying very hard to develop Africa. That country is China. But when China goes to Africa, America gets upset and says, no, you're being expansionist. You shouldn't develop Africa. But then Europe is joining in with America and disapproving of Chinese investment in Africa. But Chinese investment in Africa is going to help Europe. That's what being Machiavellian is all about. You've got to figure out where your long-term interests are and stick with them and not be led by ideology. So at the end of the day, even though the title is somewhat provocative, I hope at the end of the day, my friends in the West, if they ever come to review this book in any Western journal, will see that this is an effort to tell the West, wake up. The world has changed thanks to what the West has contributed. The world has become a better place. So why don't you also adjust to the better world and change course before you really lose it? Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore, for that bracing cold shower that had been promised us. Truly brilliant. The delineation of the issues, the romp through world history, the emergence of the important facts. I'm now going to turn to the audience, and I see they've already lined up. Is it okay, Kishore, if we take 3 questions?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So we've agreed that what Kishore would like to do is to take 3 questions at a time, and then he'll respond to them. And as we go on, can I make sure that I want to allow a woman to ask a question as well. And right now, we have no women at any of the microphones, so just a bit of a nudge along. But please, go ahead.
Kishore, thank you very much for a wake-up call. But what I would like to ask you, why do you want to be a good Samaritan and write the love letter to the West to wake them up? Why not let China and India get their rightful ascendancy? Why do you want to do that? Let them go on to sleep.
Thank you very much. See, that's what most people think about when they think of Machiavellian. All right, Sanchi.
Thank you, Dean. Welcome back home from India. Yeah. Okay. Actually, my question was similar to the ladies, but now I changed my question. Okay. Okay. Basically, my question is same. It's like isn't it good if the West to continue to lose? Isn't it good for our the continuous rise of Asia? Okay. My question is that if you look at the GDP growth, actually, U.S. kept growth for the decades. It's just in relative terms. In relative terms, U.S. declined. It means Asia grew more quickly than West. So why do you think that's a loss of the West? I think in the nominal term, U.S. is continue growing.
please allow me to address a provocative book with an equally provocative question. You mentioned the 3 M's: minimalism, multilateralism, and Machiavelli. Have you missed out another M? Media. Has the West lost it with the media? And in that regard, I'm referring to fake news. What has the East done better on fake news, or what can it do better and learn from the West?
You know, you're absolutely right. In fact, actually, I do address the book. I do address the question in the book, and I say, what I say in this book is that I'm sure my friends in the third world are going to ask the question, why is Kishore, whom we thought was a friend of the third world, encouraging the West to become Machiavellian? And I answer the question in the book by saying that if the West doesn't change course, if it continues on autopilot, if it continues to intervene, for example, in the Middle East, right, there will be problems that will spill over to the rest of the world. And frankly, when you look, for example, at the bombings in Surabaya, right, which are very tragic and very sad and claimed by ISIS, you know, I'm not an expert, but go and study what created ISIS, right, or what created Al-Qaeda. And in my book, I think, The New Asian Hemisphere, there's now direct evidence that Al-Qaeda was created by the CIA as an instrument to be used against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So when you start intervening, you create, and I can tell you the most provocative thing I say in this book, which is actually quite frighteningly provocative, is that even an administration like the Obama administration, which is sober, balanced, you know, not at all excitable, during the time of the Obama administration, the United States facilitated the passage of ISIS fighters from Afghanistan to Syria to get rid of Assad. Now that's the kind of intervention which is very unwise. And so they may intervene, but we can suffer the consequences. And the thing that worries me, which is what I'm writing the book about this year on US-China relations, if the United States doesn't adjust to the fact that now there's a power that is as large or maybe larger than the United States, and tries, and sometimes these decisions are not made rationally, and the United States tries, maybe even indirectly, to thwart China's rise, I can tell you that any escalation of competition between United States and China will create a very uncomfortable world for many countries, including Singapore. So that's why I'm saying be Machiavellian. The more careful the West is, the better it is for us. And I also agree with you, by the way, that the US has not declined. By the way, I want to emphasize one thing. The United States is a great society. The United States will continue to do very well. And we want the United States to continue to do very well because the level of innovation that the United States brings to the world is quite remarkable. And I must say, after spending 3 months in American universities, they're still by far the best universities in the world. So we don't. I'm not wishing for a decline of America, not wishing for a decline of Europe. I actually want to see a stronger America and a stronger Europe, and a stronger America and a stronger Europe that pays attention to what it really should be doing is good for the world. And one that's less interventionist and focuses on its economic growth and development, that's good for the world. So that's why I'm also advocating. So this is not an in that sense, an anti-Western statement. Now on the media, I must say, this one will require another book. But you know, if you look at my book, The Can Asians Think, which I'm also going to be launching later, I have an essay, I think about the freedom of the media and what its strengths and what its weaknesses are. I've written, it's actually a 5,000-word essay. It's a very long essay. Because it's a very complex subject. You see, on the one hand, there's absolutely no doubt that the world's best media channels are Western media channels. If you really want to understand the world, you still got to read, whether you like it or not, the Financial Times, New York Times, Wall Street. You have to read The Economist, because they still dominate the media scene. But the mistake that they make is in believing that their one point of view is the only correct point of view. And one thing that the West needs to do in terms of what you combat is fake news is not the issue now. What the fundamental change in the world is that we are moving from a mono-civilizational world to a multi-civilizational world, but we're moving from a mono-civilizational world to a multi-civilizational world with mono-civilizational lenses in the Western media. So we got to convert the mono-civilizational lenses of the Western media and make them multi-civilizational lenses. And that's a bigger issue than the fake news issue.
I actually have got two questions regarding about your talk. The first question I have to ask is that I would submit that when it comes to the West's own disdain towards ASEAN, I believe is there really actually also part of the concern that certain countries that are dictatorial in nature are not changing fast enough. The second question I also would like to go and ask is that when it comes to, what you really consider, Machiavellian, I personally might consider, submit that you would make use of a more appropriate term that would be, realpolitik.
I guess my question is, does the East, mainly China, followed by India, really have what it takes to take on the West? My sense would be that even in the next 100 years, the West would be ahead of the East philosophically, culturally, media-wise as well, entertainment-wise. And it's hard for me to imagine a situation in which China, as anybody that is non-Chinese, wants to be Chinese in the same way that the rest of the world now wants to be American or wants to be West in essence, right? So, it's hard for me to imagine how, if China can be more than just a producer or a distributor or an investor, and whether you think that it's possible that China can be that, whether it has the kind of chops. China has kind of been stuck as a neo-Confucian for the last, thousands of years, whereas the West has continued to produce philosopher after philosopher, scientist after scientist, which reconfigures the way we see the world, right?
I was doing the WTO introduction for China on behalf of Harvard in 2004 in Shanghai. And we had Long Yung-to and all the Chinese officials and 1,000 people. And we were trying to teach the Chinese WTO. And now, after Trump did his tariffs, they are trying to teach Trump WTO. The point here is this. If the West has lost it, if I could present 2 points, and the question is with the second point. The first point is, we had a leader here who spoke to us, the British Prime Minister, at the time when Brexit was very, very crucial issue, and what he spoke to us about, anti-corruption, which Lee Kuan Yew has taught us for 50 years. And now we come to Trump. And the question is, how long will he last? Because he may have system in his madness, and he may be more Machiavellian than we all think. And if history would show, Savonarola, the mad monk, during Columbus' time, lasted 5 years. So people think maybe he'll last 4 years before he's impeached or chucked out in the next election. But if we look at Iran, the Iranian Revolution led by Khomeini, a small group at that time, it lasted from 1979 to now, 40 over years. And minorities control governments. They've just had elections in Iraq. Who's the winner? The winner is Muqtada. He's the Shiite who fought the Americans. And the Americans have invested a great deal there. And so the question is, how long will this man last? Because he may have one small group, but it's a long-lasting group, maybe.
The first question, I think you're right. The key word is realpolitik, and I'm, in a sense, talking about realpolitik. But I also want to emphasize that realpolitik, that behind realpolitik, there are also other dimensions, like economic dimensions, cultural dimensions, and all that you have to come to place. And I think, for example, in your first point about ASEAN, I think the time has come for the West to pay more respect to ASEAN. That's completely clear. The second question, I must say, by the venture capitalists is a very, very profound question. And you're right. I mean, actually, nobody knows. We have lived in a world which has been dominated by the West for 200 years or more. Frankly, none of us know what it's going to be like to live in a world where China and India are the dominant powers, okay? It won't be China and India, by the way. The projections are by 2050, the number one power in PPP terms will be China, number two will be India, number three, United States of America, number four will be Japan. So it'll be a much more multipolar world and not just China and India. But we've got so used to the idea that the dominant powers will always try to intervene in other countries and try and refashion the countries or reshape the countries. I don't think China will be that kind of an imperial power. The Chinese, this is a very sensitive thing. The Chinese are not trying to make other people Chinese. You know, when I go to China, I don't speak Chinese. They don't try to make me Chinese. They appreciate the fact that I'm different. And they don't have the kind of what you might call the messianic desire to change the world in the way that the West did. So it's a different kind of... So the global chemistry will change fundamentally. But at the end of the day, the only question you need to ask is, will we all be better off? And my simple answer to your question is that we will all be better off. Because we will have greater scope to develop ourselves and be ourselves in that kind of a world with no dominant force dominating it. Now, Anthony, I must confess that I pretend to know lots of things, but I do not know how long Trump will last. But I can tell you, to be fair, I won $100 when Trump won. I won a bet. And then the same guy who lost the bet said to me, Kishore, he will not survive 1 year. I said, he'll survive 1 year. I won another $100. So I made lots of money with Trump staying in office. And I think I would say that, I'll tell you something. I was in Beijing recently with an unusual group of 5 people. The 5 people were Carl Bernstein of Bernstein Woodward fame, Tom Friedman, Niall Ferguson, Martin Wolf, and myself. 5 of us were invited to meet a group of Chinese leaders. It was a great privilege, by the way. And at one of the sessions, one of the leaders, Niall Ferguson, said something, and I don't think he'll mind me saying it. You know, he said to the Chinese this. He said, if you want to understand Trump, don't read what the New York Times tells you. And he was pointing to Tom Friedman. Don't read what the Financial Times tells you. He was pointing to Martin Wolf. Because he said both New York Times and Financial Times will convince you that Donald Trump is an imbecile. But let me tell you this, he's no imbecile. He's obviously canny in his own way. So I would say that in some ways, the liberal media does the world a great disservice, because in their reporting on Trump, which is supposed to be objective and neutral, it is not objective and neutral. Even the reporting pages. And so because we are prisoners of the liberal media, we inherit their biases, and we obviously think that Donald Trump is an imbecile or useless and so on and so forth. And I think I would say that while Donald Trump has done some things which are very badly wrong, I must say he's done the world a great favor by agreeing to meet Kim Jong-un. There was a time when the situation on the Korean Peninsula was very tense and people were playing out war scenarios. And I was at a public panel in Seoul, South Korea, next to Professor Jia Jing-ko of Peking University. And I was shocked. This is a public statement. I can quote him. He said, it's time for China and America to start talking about how they will deal with each other if a war breaks out in the Korean Peninsula. I never thought a Chinese professor would say this, you know. So the fact that Donald Trump has reduced the temperature on the Korean Peninsula and created the possibility of a solution is something we should be grateful for. And if they give him a Nobel Peace Prize, I'll be very happy. We've got peace in the Korean Peninsula.
My question is like this. You mentioned that the 1946 Bretton Woods Agreement and the United Nations give the world unparalleled prosperity of the last 80 years. Now the question is that America now, the originator of this agreement, was apparently going into discarding multilateralism. But we must remember that when America put this institution, its GDP was half of the world. Now, no matter how China and India grow, the projection is that China's GDP today is 15% of the world, and it will peak around 22 to 23%. So that means that it will take some time for them to make a new global orders. Now, in this regard, if you want minimalist approach now of the West, and if you look at the Middle East, the American withdrawal has created many middle power trying to assert primacy in the regions. The Saudis, the Israelis, the Iranians, the Turkeys. And we have seen what happened now to the Middle East. The situation on the ground become uncontrollable. So what is the risk now is, will there be a Kinderberger trope that is appearing in the absence of a new global orders to replace the old global orders that the Americans put in place?
You spoke in glowing terms about the Western multilateral organizations in economics and politics and diplomacy, military. Isn't that a form of constant intervention in the world and how the world actually functions? And then my second part of the question is, what is the alternative to intervention? So for every Myanmar that you mentioned, there are places like Congo, which has huge civil wars going on for decades, forgotten conflicts, because there is no intervention. And is it okay that we think that it's going to be a better outcome to just let these places rot on their own without seeking solutions based on these multilateral institutions?
I'd like to ask you something in relation to your question, your theory on the town council of a global village. So, how likely do you think that a shuffle in the permanent 5 countries in the UN Security Council to better reflect the changing balance of power in the world will occur in the next 1 or 2 decades?
You're absolutely right, the question of EAI, that all these institutions were created in 1945 when America had half the world's GNP. So it's a very different world, and America was very self-confident, very strong, very benign, very generous. And the question is, can it continue to be equally benign, generous, and so on and so forth? And in my view, my sense after 3 months in the United States is that while the mainstream establishment, especially under Trump administration, is obviously very anti-multilateral, there are, I think, enough thoughtful voices within the intellectual establishment in America that understand that actually we do need to strengthen multilateral institutions. And I would say one of the things that really pleased me about being in the US for the last 3 months is that I met lots of people who actually had read my writings. And they would actually say to me, you know, that your writings help us a lot because they make us see a very different point of view. So on multilateralism, while I see that Trump will be very, very anti-multilateral, I would expect the pendulum to swing back towards more multilateralism or more support of multilateralism. And it is, by the way, very helpful that China has decided to make a very brave decision to actually support the multilateral order that America and the West gifted to the world. And so I was in Davos last year. in January 2017 when President Xi Jinping spoke. And I found his speech very inspiring because he said, hey, this is a great world. We can make it stronger. We have to work together. And that was, for me, was very encouraging. So I would say that the battle for multilateralism is not lost. Now, coming to your point about when I say that these interventions are wrong, are we going to condemn the Congos of the world and so on and so forth? Actually, the opposite will happen. And you notice that let me give you very simple. The United States has intervened in Iraq twice. First time under Father Bush. Second time under Son Bush. Father Bush, great success story. Son Bush, disaster. What's the difference? Father Bush sent envoys to over 100 countries and got over 100 countries to participate in the intervention in Iraq, got UN Security Council authorization, and it was a legal and legitimate intervention. Son Bush tried to get UN Security Council legitimization. I was the ambassador of Singapore to the UN Security Council, so I know what happened inside. And he failed. And when he failed, under international law, as Kofi Annan said, the war became illegal. And you saw the results of an illegal war. So I'm not saying give up on all the Congos in the world, but if you have multilaterally endorsed, legitimate and legal interventions, they work much better. And so if you get a larger part of the global community involved, you get much better results. And I can tell you that the existing institutions can do the job. Then finally, on the Roger Will's question about the P5, I've actually written a whole book on it called The Great Convergence. The paradox about the UN Security Council, by the way, incidentally, the UN Security Council in theory is run by 15 countries, 10 elected members, 5 permanent members, the P5. In practice, the 10 elected members are tourists on the UN Security Council, and the 5 P5 run the council. And the problem is that the P5 who run the council are the ones who won World War II in 1945. So clearly, it's good to have great powers in the Security Council, but you want tomorrow's great powers and not yesterday's great powers. And changing the composition is going to be very difficult. But let me just leave one thought with you. The challenge that the P5 is going to have is that they've got to choose between the composition of the UN Security Council, which they want to keep, and the credibility. So if you don't change the composition, you will lose the credibility. Then nobody will pay attention to the UN Security Council. If you want to preserve the credibility, then you've got to change the composition. So at some point in time, and this is what I discussed in the book, The Great Convergence, the change will come. But it'll be very difficult, very painful.
And actually, my question has also much to do with the multilateralism, and you answered many of them. What is your concrete advice to the East to enhance multilateralism? And if you could imagine an ideal multilateral system, what would it look like?
Very recently, China actually attempted to defund human rights programs through the UN Fifth Budget Committee. And also, the UN Human Rights Commissioner has resigned from his position as he argued that human rights weren't actually given enough credibility and wasn't actually paid attention to in the UN. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think China actually supports the UN and its goals?
Hello, Professor Kishore. I'm from China. I just wanted to know how do you think of the welfare system in Western world? Because I think that the fundamental stone in Western world is something wrong. The Western fundamental stone in Western world is prevent poverty. I think that is not correct thing in this world.
So do you think that China will be able to manipulate institutions like the WTO while being accused of foul play in institutions like the WTO, keeping in mind that China is currently in court with the WTO and many Western countries because of China's blatant disregard of WTO regulations?
These are very, very good questions. And I have to give you, unfortunately, telegraphic answers. Now, the first one about multilateralism, I want to emphasize one point. I'm a great lover of the United Nations. I'm a great lover of multilateral institutions. That's the theme of my book, The Great Convergence. And I think these are some of the most underrated institutions in the world. And I can tell you, as having been ambassador to the UN twice, from 84 to 89, and 98 to 2004, please don't read what the Western media tells you about the United Nations. It's all fake news. The United Nations does heroic jobs in many, many places. The second question about China and the UN, whether China defunding HR programs and so on and so forth, and that's wrong. Wrong. But unfortunately, the system of defunding UN programs was started, and this is illegal, by the United States and the West. And so that's the thing that the United States should change. It should stop its illegal defunding of programs. And this is a subject that is very complex, and I think it's wrong for China to follow the footsteps of the United States in that area. And about China and the WTO, I can tell you this. China today is the biggest beneficiary of the World Trade Organization because it's the world's largest trading nation. I guarantee you this, if the WTO makes a ruling, China will abide by it because China is the biggest beneficiary of the system. And to be fair, until now, so far, the United States has also abided by every WTO ruling. That's amazing, you know. We live in an amazing world when the great powers who can actually ignore the rulings still abide by them, although they are backing away from some of them. So I'm hoping that both United States and China will come back together to strengthen the WTO. Finally, on welfare systems, that's of course a very, very big question. But let me just say a couple of very quick bullet points. Number one, if you ask me what is an ideal society in domestic terms, I point to the Scandinavian societies. They have welfare societies, but they have productive and innovative populations. So Singapore should learn from the Scandinavian countries, and they're not a negative model. There are other aspects of the welfare system that have created a dependent population, and those are bad welfare systems, and those we have to get rid of. But the biggest threat about the welfare systems, unfortunately, and this is, of course, I'm going to end with a very provocative point, is that in the United States, you don't have a welfare system to take care of the poor. You have a welfare system to take care of the rich. Because the rich control the United States Congress, and the United States Congress feeds all kinds of subsidies to the rich. And at the end of the day, the rich get more money from the welfare system in America than the poor do. So the welfare system is something that's big, that's got to be fixed. But fortunately, we can learn from the Scandinavians. So thank you very much.
Kishore.